Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Culture Clash podcast, where a Russian American discuss and debate some of the hot news topics in the news from the past week. So our four topics for today are the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria and the implications around that, the collapse of the French government, the assassination of the CEO for United Healthcare, and then some mass layoffs that are taking place at a lot of large companies globally, including Volkswagen and others. So with that, welcome back, Vlad. How was your leave of absence?
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, that was good. That was good. Just a chill vacation, chill weekend. Don't worry.
Good. Hope you're well rested. Hope then you prepared extra for this episode since you had all the time to rest.
Yes, I want to start with one very small news, but you should be happy about it. Have you heard Time magazine today? They announced the man of the year.
Who is it?
Who was it?
Yeah.
It was Trump.
Wow. No surprise.
What do you think about it?
What do I think about it? I mean, he had a big year. He's president again. So I think it's fitting. I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I think he was the loudest person. It was either him or Elon Musk.
So, Vlad, I think we start with the biggest news topic from the past week, which is the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria. So how would you assess and sort of discuss what happened? Is it a geopolitical earthquake? Is it something that is sort of not too big of a deal? What's your assessment on what's taken place in Syria and what it means for the wider region and geopolitics globally?
Wow, I think we couldn't find the harder question to begin with. Of course, this particular topic was discussed in Russian news very intensely, because I think over the recent, over the recent 50 years, Syria was considered as a very important point for Russia. Since 1970s, Russia had the military presence over there, business presence over there, political presence, political influence, and basically Syria was the major influential point for Russia, not only in the Middle East, but also a very important point for Africa. So, and of course, it was all discussed, and I think we all can remember that in 2011 and 2016, when there was a civil war in Syria, and Russia stepped in supporting the Assad regime and basically saved it at that time and influenced it a lot. And basically since that time, we could always hear that Russia and Syria, they're allies, Russia will back them all the time. And I think even now, I think we will talk about it in a moment, but even now we can see that Russia still backed in a way Assad's regime. So I think the first implication I would like to consider over here is what would happen with Russian influence after the regime change. And the way I personally can see it, based on the news and based on the analysis that I can see, is Russia is ready to continue working with the new regime, with the new power, whatever it will be. Because if we think about this, the next day after the change was announced, the next day in Russia, in Moscow, in Syrian embassy, they changed the flags from the old government, old flag, to the new government flag, the rebellion's flag. Then immediately they changed the media tone, the media terms that they use, because over the recent, years, they were calling rebels as terrorists or as extremists or Islamists, whatever. But then, the moment the regime changed, now they are called armed opposition, legitimate armed opposition. And it's important to understand that Russia currently have the several military bases in Syria. They have the air base, they have the naval base I think since 1974. And this is very important for them to keep this presence. This is very important for them to keep this presence because, as I mentioned, this opens the door for military presence in the region, but also it opens the door for the business tracks to Africa. They, since 1970s, Soviet Union and Russia, they used this path to basically to securely transfer goods from Russia to Africa and back. So if they lose this gate, this will be major implication for them. So they will try to do as much as they can to keep it. Then another thing is, so whether it's an earthquake, I don't know if it's an earthquake, but it definitely will have the outside implications for the implications for Russian geopolitics, what they're gonna do about this situation in the region. Then another point, as I mentioned, the internal perspective, and this is where I think in my personal opinion, the major tension can be, because we all know that when you have the common enemy, then it's very easy to unite multiple groups. The moment the common enemy is gone, everything can happen, and I'm concerned that the removal of the common enemy, the change of the regime, might lead to the chaos, and the chaos is very hard to manage, very hard to govern. So I'm afraid that this might lead to actually an earthquake, and there is a possibility that instead of the more or less stable government or predictable government, we will receive the boiling cauldron in the region, another boiling cauldron actually. And then the third point is what would happen with the neighboring states, because obviously the whole change happened with direct or indirect influence, support, or involvement of the neighboring states, meaning Turkey. Meaning, like, we can name Turkey. We definitely understand that the Israel's influence was there because of the conflict with Lebanon, with Palestine, and all of this. So this, like, and actually this regime change, it adds another like boiling point to the hot region as well. So whether it will become the earthquake, yes, I think there is a major probability that it will become even if it's not an earthquake, but it may become a very, like, it will have very strong consequences for the region and for the like macro region of Eurasia in general. That's what I think.
Interesting. So I would actually disagree slightly. I think basically you summarized it very well. I think particularly the Russian connection is obviously a huge implication there for Russia and again the surrounding states and whatnot. But I would classify it and describe it exactly as the question was posed, which is that it is a geopolitical earthquake. I think this is one of the biggest events to happen in the Middle East probably in the last at least 20 years, to be honest, because if you look at what the wider implication for the regime was and what Syria really meant in the region, this was a key country that, and again, just to maybe go back and give our listeners and our viewers some context. So again, the civil war started in 2011. It was, operating on and off for most of 7 or so years, and they sort of achieved a relative peace. But more or less, it was going for the last 15 years, the civil war, in some way, shape, or form. More than 500,000 people were killed. Millions of people were left homeless. It helped to precipitate the European migrant crisis. There was a lot of implications, obviously, around this conflict. And I think you laid it out. When you look at the factions involved, it was a mini sort of global war just on the territory of Syria. So again, the folks backing Assad, you had Iran, obviously, who was a major supporter of the Iran regime. As you mentioned, Russia, which had obviously the military bases and the influence and playing a major role in helping to support Assad during the worst moments of the civil war when it looked like the Assad regime might fall. The Russian air power came in. The Iranians added a lot of support from some of their militia groups. So all of that combined served to support and buttress the Assad regime. Then the folks opposing him, it was a wide coalition, as you mentioned, but obviously you had the local rebels in Syria. You had the U.S., the UK, France, who were all providing weaponry and support and logistics to the rebel groups. You had Israel, Turkey. You had, again, a wide plethora of traditional allies who were then opposed to the regime. So when it comes to the consequences of what this means and why I would describe it as a geopolitical earthquake, what you had before, maybe 10 days ago or 15 days ago, or even going maybe a little bit further back before things, heated up in Lebanon and whatnot. But you essentially had this corridor of alliances between Iran, between Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And that corridor was essentially the capacity for Iran to support its allies in the region, all of which were allies in some way, shape, or form. So that was made up of militia groups, obviously some in Lebanon. That was the regime in Syria. That was obviously the regime and a lot of militia groups in Iraq. So losing that land corridor, which is essentially what's happened now, that means Iranian influence in the region, and not just in Syria, but in the wider region. That means in Lebanon. That means other countries around as well, they don't have that capacity. It's been severely limited by this event. So if you look at Iran as one of the major powers in the Middle East, and obviously a key ally of Russia, a key ally of China, you now have a country that's been severely weakened in its capacity to influence, again, the wider Middle East. So I think it's a major event. I think Iran is now quite isolated. I think it's looking around the region, doesn't have, the friends that it once had, and obviously is dealing with a much more complicated situation from its own perspective. I think Turkey is able to increase its influence and now, obviously have a much, much better strategic position by having their allies in Syria, because again, they've been big supporters of the opposition forces. So I think that's great for Turkey. I think Israel, of course, benefits as well, because the Assad regime was effectively an enemy of Israel. So I think when you frame it from that perspective, you did have clear winners. But again, we don't know what's going to fill the void. We don't know what's going to come next. And that's going to be the big question mark. But on the surface, on the face of it, it appears that Iran and its allies, including Russia, were the biggest losers in this, and America and its allies were the biggest winners. So whether, again, the U.S., Israel, Turkey, it seems like they're the ones who appear to be the winners, if you want to call it that. And obviously the rebels and the Syrian people would perhaps say that they themselves are the winners as well, obviously. But just from a geopolitical dynamic, I think that's really what we're looking at. So I think, again, very interesting. And the point that, to me, brought home what these consequences really are is if you look at the main rebel leader, a guy named Al-Jolani is his name. He had a quote which was given in his interview with CNN, and he had said that this new triumph marks a new chapter in the history of the region, a history fraught with dangers that left Syria as a playground for Iranian ambitions, spreading sectarianism and stirring corruption. So he called out Iran particularly, whereas he didn't call out any other country in the region. So I think that sort of provides the conclusion as to, again, who was the biggest loser. To me, it was Iran. Obviously, Russia, we don't know yet what the extent and what the change in the relationship will be between Syria and Russia. But certainly, I think Iran is the biggest loser here. So I think from a geopolitical perspective, again, geopolitical earthquake, I think the ramifications are huge. I think the entire balance of power in the region has now changed. And again, we'll see what comes next, but I think that's going to be, I think that's the initial assessment that I would have. And what comes next is going to be interesting and hopefully good for everybody, but time will tell. We'll see.
I would add to this point that I think, and like what I also read in the analysis and so in different like already existing analytical videos about the event, even though it's like happened in the recent 12 days. I think everybody is quite aligned in the point that even though it was the regime change and it was with some militants involved, it was relatively peaceful, without huge amount of victims. And we understand that in many cases, like the government army, they just like surrendered or decided not to participate. We know that like even some enemies, like they even just left the country and that's it. And we understand also that the external powers, I mean, Russia, Iran, they decided also not to intervene, not to involve. I mean, the reasons might be different. Like for Russia, it might be Ukraine or something else. But anyway, the fact is, everybody decided not to involve, and that's the whole regime was relatively, like the whole change was relatively peaceful. And we also know that even part of the former regime supporters, they still participate in the transition stage, in the transition period. That makes me actually hopeful that that inside component that I mentioned in the beginning and that you also mentioned, that this inside component, like we will not get the chaos and another like boiling pot. So that peaceful change makes me, at least for the moment, hopeful about this.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I think that's, again, something everybody wants to see for really the Syrian people, right? I mean, if you look at how much suffering was caused by this conflict, 13 years of brutal conflict. I mean, again, some of the damage and destruction, I think the country lost a quarter of its population, huge migrant crisis. This was a prosperous country for a long period of time, in the post-World War II era, right? So to see it finally conclude, and again, as you said, to do so in a relatively bloodless way. Again, obviously there was some fighting, but I think everything was concluded in 10 days, something unbelievable, where again, this war was being fought 13 years, and then suddenly in 10 days, the regime apparatus collapses. And again, the concern would have been, are you going to see a lot of reprisals? Are you going to see violence and revenge being taken out? But what it appears, as you mentioned, is that many of the ministers who were in power just before Assad left are still there helping with the transition.
Yeah.
So in some ways, it looks like you might have some semblance of a national unity, not government per se, but at least a transition period where, again, it's not going to be filled with reprisals, with revenge, with violence. And again, for a country that saw 13 years of that, I think that's welcome for everybody. And hopefully, to your point, can limit whatever negative ramifications might come next. Let's, ideally avoid chaos, ideally be able to rebuild and bring back, prosperity for the people in Syria. So I think, let's see, we don't know what's going to come of it, but I think all things considered, for some sort of, rebellion, for it to have gone the way it did, I think is probably everybody in the country, probably everybody in Syria would say, I would imagine that it was, again, best case scenario to have not been this violent, terrible, again, drag it out for another 5 years. So yeah, let's see.
There is another point that I also heard that makes me think whether this change was actually planned from both sides. Because right after the regime changed, I also saw the news. I saw it first in Russian media, and then I saw the article in Financial Times. And they say that they conducted the research, the investigation, and they identified that Assad family, they bought 19 apartments, 19 pieces of prime property in Moscow over the recent months, and combined, they distributed around $2 billion assets in different offshore zones in the world. So I don't know,
and this was before the last
that was
2
before.
weeks.
That was before.
Wow.
According to the article, it happened over the recent 5 years. 19 pieces of property in Moscow City. This is the prime area.
I was going to say, it well, right?
This is the luxury prime piece.
How much would a typical, for example, you just said 19 piece of property. What would a typical piece of property in?
So now it's a little bit hard to say because of the currency rate, the exchange rate. But overall, these apartments, they start with several $1 million per piece. Several $1 million. Several, tens of millions.
Tens of millions. Wow. Okay. I was going to say, is that 5, 6, tens of millions?
Tens of millions. Okay. Yeah. Because they're huge. It's prime property. It's if you have you seen the Moscow City, the district?
I mean, I've been to Moscow many times. Yeah.
So
is it near the Red Square, or is it
no?
Business
It's
District,
it's the business district. It's the downtown, wow. with the skyscrapers and one of the tallest buildings in Europe. Mm-hmm. So I think we will show the picture over here just for people to understand what it's about. And and then they also in the investigation they mentioned around $2 billion distributed all over the world. Wow. Which is I don't know, to me it looks like some sort of preparation, or at least some sort of the safety pillow, something like this, safety cushion, some
sort of backup plan just in case everything.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's wild. And again, for everything to collapse as quickly as it did and the way it did, to see that, again, as you mentioned, some sort of plan must have been in place, right? To go right to Moscow, to be welcomed in, to have property lined up and everything. It seems, as you said, that some kind of contingency planning had taken place and whatever. But it's interesting because then I saw a lot of people criticizing what the Russians did by taking him in. Mm-hmm. And of course, you're always going to get people who, want to criticize, one side for taking in, one regime leader versus the other. But the U.S. did the same thing, for example, when the Shah fell in Iran. And it was a huge political issue actually between Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian revolutionary government once the Shah was kicked out, because the Americans took him in. And he was sick. I think he had cancer or something like that. Jimmy Carter invited him to come to the U.S., and he did, and he lived out the rest of his life in the U.S. But that caused a major political issue between Iran and the U.S. for a period of time. But again, this is something that you would typically see, right, between close allies to do something like that. So I think that's not surprising really to anybody, but I think the money component is quite interesting.
Yeah,
and
interesting.
As you said, probably implies that there was some sort of planning around that and whatnot. So yeah, very interesting. I mean, again, I think the biggest takeaway for me is just, how after a 13-year brutal conflict, again, with all the ramifications that it led to, obviously leading to the rise of extremist groups like ISIS that was able to take place because of the chaos that was happening in Syria. So all of the pain and destruction and death that was coming from Syria from this 13 years, and for all of it to conclude in 10 days, and to conclude, as you said, relatively peacefully, I think it's really mind-boggling, honestly. It's wild, really, to think about. And again, the implications around it to be so significant and yet so quickly resolved, I think it's going to be really interesting, again, to see what comes next. I think we can all hope for the best, and certainly do. But yeah, we'll see. Yeah. We'll see what comes next.
We'll see the consequences. Yeah, that might be very, very interesting and challenging as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Excellent. So next question.
Let's go to the next one.
All right. So another government collapse, now in a slightly different fashion. So this wasn't a civil war, but the next topic is the collapse of the French government. So apparently government's collapsing all over the place, and just sign of the times, I guess. But you had in France the first government collapse since 1962 on a no confidence vote. So my question to you, Vlad, is what is your takeaway or analysis on what's happening in France? What are the implications around this? And what does this mean basically for either France, or even if you have a wider context with the French government collapsing?
This is an interesting one, and I think this is another piece of the puzzle that we already talked about in our previous videos, that it seems like we can see the trend in Europe where we can say that there are some political forces, whether it's right-wing parties or some Eurosceptics, we can call them, there are some political forces gaining power compared to their previous positions, who are like against the European integration and the common current European political course. And I think if we look at the recent French government collapse, and I think we need to explain that government collapse doesn't mean that the country does not exist anymore, that it was the non-confidence vote from the parliament to the ministers, because they tried to approve the budget, like, how you say it, like they tried to approve the budget without the parliament approval.
Yep.
Yeah. So there was huge budgetary disputes. And then we know that in France, there has always been political fragmentation, and it's getting even stronger. So we know that the right wing, again, they gain power. The Marine Le Pen party, they get the more power. So this one, plus also we know that France has the increasing political debt. The budget debt, increasing budget debt, economic stagnation. The same problems is with other major European countries. And since France is one of the pillars of the European integration, along with Germany and Italy, like the major powers in Europe, to me, the way I see this, the biggest implications from this can be as another illustration of, I don't want to say like another nail into the European integration coffin, but it seems something like another piece of the puzzle of this changing trend in European integration, where we will see more and more and more Eurosceptics in the upcoming future.
Yep. So I totally agree. I will actually use the words that you didn't want to use. I do think it's, again, a further nail in the coffin for European integration, for the wider EU project. And the reasons, again, it's much wider than just this vote. This vote in and of itself is not a game changer. It's not necessarily the end of the world. It's not an earthquake like what obviously would happen in Syria. That was in my opinion, earthquake from a political perspective. This is not, but it's still significant. I think for all the reasons you said, but I want to point ourselves in the direction of some of the data and some of the reasons why this is important. So again, I mentioned this is the first government collapse due to a no confidence vote since 1962. Obviously, 1962, you were still dealing with some of the fallout and ramifications of the post-World War II era. Very different dynamics, obviously. Interestingly, this was initiated by, and again, this is a very common theme we've talked about. We talked about this with Germany. We've talked about it with some of the wider issues, even in the U.S. political system. But again, this spreads throughout Europe, that the left and right opposition were the ones who initiated the no confidence vote because they opposed the budget measures that Macron was trying to pass. So again, it had something to do with Social Security reforms, as well as cutting $65 billion from the budget. So again, you had the far right, who's the biggest opposition party, single biggest party actually in the French Parliament, and then the second biggest, which is the left bloc. So again, both of them were coming out in agreement to say they're opposed to these type of cuts to the federal budget. So, and again, what this means is if the center is not able to govern, who's going to be the ones who eventually are able to govern and usher in whatever change that the people are looking for? And again, we said it, we've been saying it consistently. I know I was arguing this on the Germany episode. For me, it absolutely is going to be the right-wing opposition or the populist left-wing opposition, because again, the center is no longer holding. They're not able to get any of their agenda items passed. So at some point, these folks will continue to lose ground in elections until eventually we're going to see, in my opinion, most likely the rise of the far right or even possibly the rise of the far left. And the reason I say that is if you look at recent elections in France. So for example, let's go to the 2024, actually in July. So a few months ago, there was legislative elections in France. And the biggest winner was the far right. So the far right actually underperformed. People thought they would do better than they did, but they still won the most votes as the single biggest party, the single biggest bloc, at 37% of the overall vote. And this was again back in July.
This was National Front?
Yeah, National Front, exactly. Marine Le Pen's party and the alliance of the far right. So that's a 20% increase from only 2 years prior, back in 2022. So very clearly this massive ascendancy that you're seeing in the far right in France, which again we've seen in Germany, which again we've seen in Italy, we're seeing it really across the European Union. So then you had the left, who again as a bloc, the collective left won 26% of the vote in July this year, which was actually down from 2022, down by 6%. Macron's party, the center, actually won 25%, so they were the third largest party. And then the center right, who again was one of the main pillars of French politics, only won 5% of the vote. So what we're clearly seeing is you have this massive divergence where the far right is clearly the most ascendant, but elements of the far left are too. So to me, this is really where the future is going to be battled out, because in countries like this, where the governments are not able to pass anything and they can't even get budgets, they can't even, enact most of their agenda, eventually what that's going to mean is that you're going to be ceding political power to somebody else. So again, the far right at 37%, if the current government's not going to be able to get a budget passed, what's going to happen the next go around? So the next presidential election is planned for 2027, where the far right is clearly the favorite at this point. So if you look at the current polls, which again are absurd from 3 years out, but at least they give you an idea as to, get a sense of the public at this stage and where things, might be going. Le Pen right now is polling, again, the far right. She's the leader of the far right party, the National Rally, I think it's called. She's polling at anywhere between 35 and 40% in that first round of the vote. Whereas again, in 2022, the last time she was in the election, she was polling in the high 20s, low 30s. So she's clearly expanded support maybe by up to 10 percentage points, which is, again, she lost to Macron. She only got 41% last time. But again, this is a consistent trend where it seems every election, every opportunity, the far right outperforms, does better than they did before. The far left outperforms, and the middle continues to shrink. And you've got this clear receding in the middle, which is obviously being, replaced by mainly the far right, but then also the far left. And I do want to point your attention to, in the wider context, and why I think this is important is, again, this is a French story, but it's a European story. We talked about Germany, 2 weeks ago. There's a bigger story. Did you see what happened in Romania?
Of course.
Over the past few weeks. Okay, this is closer to your home country. This was insane to me about what happened. So everybody was expecting the election held on November 24th to go a certain direction. You had this independent candidate who was essentially being called a far-right guy. He's anti-Ukraine aid. He's very much a nationalist, far-right, all of these things in Romania. So again, not necessarily a core EU country, but strategically positioned, has a border with Ukraine, one of the eastern flanks, again, of NATO and the European Union. He came out of nowhere, totally unexpected, and got the most votes in the first round of the election, November 24th. The second round of the vote was supposed to take place December 8th. And you saw what happened after that, right? They didn't hold the election.
Right.
So the courts actually annulled the election and said they're postponing the second round of the election on account of what was accused to be what the courts had said was Russian meddling on behalf of this far-right leader. So the courts actually postponed the election. We don't know when it's going to be yet, but at some point they're going to have it. But part of the controversy around that was that he was favored to win. So he was winning in the polls. This guy who came out of nowhere with this far-right message, nationalistic message, anti-Ukraine aid message, and came out of nowhere, won the first round, projected to win the presidency and win the second round as well. So again, this same story continues to prove itself out every step of the way, every election. Italy already elected a far-right leader. France keeps moving further and further in that direction. The far-right in Germany is ascendant. Romania, out of the blue, nobody expected it. The far-right is ascendant there too. Name me a country in the EU, and I'm telling you, the far-right is going to be ascendant. What's your sort of because
you already have the Hungary with the
Hungary obviously
with the right-wing dominance.
Poland as well.
Yes, with the rising, exactly. And I also think that if you think, I totally agree with you. If we look at the wider context, this is not about like single European member states. If we see it as a common European trend, I think these far-right movements, they will bring the threat to the entire European project. And this is something I think we need to explore this in our future topics, in future episodes, that like we need to explore the future of European integration in general. Because like when I studied international relations in the university, one of my major research was about European politics and the way European Union as the bureaucratic machine operates. And I don't know, but in my opinion, based on my research, even like at that time, it was 15 years ago, but I think that 10 years ago.
You can admit you're a little bit older. That's that's okay.
It's by design. It is designed in a way where it cannot be efficient for a long time. They want it to be very efficient. I know there are a lot of like pro-European politicians, there is a huge pro-European lobby in Europe anyway. But by design, the whole bloc, it's either need to be reformed, or it needs to be like reimagined, or they need to take a step back where actually the member states get some additional political freedom. I will put it this way. So what I mean is, when we see this movement where you have the far left and far right, and the centric parties, the centrist parties, they are actually the biggest European
supporters.
They call them European optimists. We have European optimists and Eurosceptics.
Yep.
Yes. So the centric parties, they are the most optimistic ones, and the right wing, of course, they're the biggest skeptics. Mm-hmm. So I think with the rise of the right wing, with a like common trend in Europe, I think we will see the huge rise of European skepticism.
So what's your assessment? I think this can be the last topic, the last sort of question on this topic. I do think we should do a completely separate, maybe even a full episode on this topic, on the history of the EU, direction where it's going. I think it's a fascinating question. What's your assessment on the future of the European project as a whole, given all these trends? And again, you touched on it, but do you have any sort of initial opinion on where this is going?
My initial opinion is like this. I still believe that, like, I do believe that it will continue, because it's very hard to wind it back. But I firmly believe that they need to either make a step forward and to reform European Union to make it more more powerful as an organization, or they need to reform it in a way where it is still an alliance, or so now it's in the middle. Now it's like we don't understand whether we are organization first, like international organization first, or we are the alliance of the member states. So they need to make this choice whether they're alliance of the single member states, like with like some things in common, like the common economic policy, for example, or common labor market. This is where, like, it's logically can land, or they need to make a step forward and to admit that, like, now we're gonna enforce and we'll make the European political institutions stronger. Now they're stuck in the middle. That's what I think, and I think they need to make a choice.
Yeah.
But honestly, I don't believe that this choice will happen in any nearest future.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And again, you mentioned that you did some sort of project in university. Yeah. I did actually a debate in university as well on the same topic. And the question, it was a final, it was like the final exam, but it was a debate format. So you needed to come well prepared, researched, and you pretty much picked your side of the argument. But both sides had to obviously disagree. So I was on the pro-EU side, and then the other folks were on the anti-EU side. And what was so interesting, because then the class would essentially vote, and then you would get a grade based on how the arguments were. And honestly, I picked the pro-EU side because I thought that was the easiest one. I was like, come on, we don't need to put that much work into it. You know, pro-EU just makes sense. Oh yeah, EU enlargement is good. Obviously the geopolitics around it, the economics. And then we got to the debate, because we were lazy around the research, because we just thought, well, the EU just sort of makes sense. So why couldn't we make the clear argument? And the other side came with all the facts, similar to what happened with Brexit, where our argument was essentially geopolitical alignment. We all want to be friends. You know, we all want common prosperity. All these sort of like fluffy arguments. Exactly. And they came out with, okay, well, what about the labor market impacts? What about the budget impacts? And we were blown away. We lost the debate. And it was obvious to me then, this is so much deeper of a question. And it goes obviously into not just the economics around it, not just the issues around free trade within the Eurozone and the European Union, not only the issues around monetary policy and a common EU tax, a common EU defense policy, all of these things, but even the cultural issue, obviously. You've got, 28 countries in the EU? How many unique languages? Probably at least like 15 or something. So that's going to be, I think, a great standalone topic. But last thing I'll say on this, from my perspective, and again, it's a bit early to declare it dead. I think the EU is dead. I think the EU, as we currently know, I know you probably expected me to say that. I think the EU, as we know it, is over, and I think it's going to die a slow death, to be honest. But I don't see a future for the EU where, again, barring massive reform, the likes of which you were talking about, probably even more. How can you have one political bloc with Romania and Portugal in the same bloc when these are on two opposite sides of the continent? France and Estonia, for example, interests are going to be totally different. The people culturally are different. The languages are different. Every element of those two countries are different. So I think let's dive into this topic in a much deeper way on another episode. But again, I think going back to the original question, this French governmental collapse is just a sign of the direction that Europe is moving into, which is a nationalist move, which is, again, the rise of the far right, perhaps elements of the far left as well. Bad for European unity, good for nationalism, and I do think it's a major event. And obviously, I think what's happening in Romania is quite important as well. So again, we'll see as more and more European elections come on. February we have Germany. So again, I think Europe is definitely an area to watch moving forward.
I think we've just made a huge teaser for the viewers.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like teaser or trailer of the future episodes.
That's right.
Now we need to do this because we actually
we have no choice. Exactly. Yes. So given that promise, we don't want to be held to account that we never talked about it. So we'll organize that, and that'll be a fun topic to go into. Excellent. Anything to add on that? Otherwise, I think
let's go to the next one.
Excellent.
Last week, we heard about the very loud assassination, loud kill of the CEO of the major insurance company, United Healthcare, in the middle of the day in the center of New York. And even though it's just like one killing, one crime, but I think there was an immediate debate rise about whether was it like the Robin Hood style kill, or the social revenge to the wealthy, greedy executive, or was it just a random psychopath who did the crime? So my question to you, Michael, what do you think? was it actually the sign of the social unhappiness, and was it the act of the social revenge to the major insurers and to the major greedy executives? Is it a sign of this unhappiness in American society, or was it just a random crime that is not worth our attention?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm going to go with the latter. I think this is just a random crime by a psychopath who, was pissed off about something, and pissed off about something very particular. So supposedly there was some sort of family connection where he had a family member who I think was denied insurance by this company for some sort of issue that they had. Again, when I was looking into this story, I thought at first maybe there would be some sort of wider, context or whatever. Again, it was a huge news story in the U.S. But the more I looked into it, the more it's just like, yeah, this is a random psychopath who, again, actually, if anything, he's got a very bizarre past, which I think is maybe the most perplexing around this question. This is a guy who was from a very wealthy and well-connected family, for example, a well-known family as well in, I think it was Maryland, I want to say, valedictorian, so smart guy, kind of a bizarre past where he was living in a surfing community for a period of time, supposedly had some injuries that's, caused him to cause his life to derail, in some way. But I really don't think there's all that much more to this story, at least that we're reading, or at least that's publicly available. So again, I think when people wanted to make this, is there social tension that's coming out here? Is there something that around healthcare that's noteworthy or something to focus on from a societal point of view? I don't think so. So again, America's famous for its relatively defunct and extremely expensive healthcare system. And that's something that was a big political issue in the 2008-2012 elections when Obama had won, and there was changes to the healthcare system in what was called Obamacare and things like that. Since then, you actually haven't seen a massive societal problem with the situation around healthcare. It's still obviously a major issue for people. It's still a major cost, both to businesses and individuals. But when I was looking at some of the polling around what are Americans' view of the current healthcare system, what I read was that 57% of all Americans, for example, think the government should guarantee that all Americans have healthcare. But the way they do that is the question. So 53% say they prefer a private health insurance system, which is the system we currently have. So again, things like United Insurance. The majority of Americans don't want to do away with the private healthcare model, which again is relatively unique in that we don't have that massive government-run healthcare system like in the UK, the NHS, the National Healthcare System, or like in most parts of Europe. So 43% of Americans do want to see a purely government-run, again, like a UK, NHS, whatever. So I couldn't find any data or anything that would explain to me that there is this massive backlash against, for example, the healthcare companies or the healthcare industry. Nothing like, for example, what maybe you could have argued back during the Occupy Wall Street movement. I don't know if you remember this, but post-financial crisis, there was a huge movement, particularly in the left wing of American politics, against the bankers and the banks themselves. If this had happened at that time to a banker, for example, one of the CEOs of the major banks, I might then say this could have a wider societal ramification or be a sign of, some sort of instability or anger within the society directed to an industry. But I just don't see it. I really don't see it. I think this is a random psychopath who had some sort of vendetta and acted on it. So that's my take. I don't know if you have,
What about the fact that this particular company, has the highest refusal rate among all the insurers? Like they refuse to pay for the claims, like the most often among all the major insurance company in America. Like, isn't it an indication of like anything?
Honestly, I really don't think so. I mean, that may be true. If my car breaks down and Ford, I'm not saying this is true, by the way, I don't want to throw Ford under the bus. Maybe let's say GM. If GM cars break down the most out of the other cars, does that lead to some sort of?
I think it's slightly different example.
It is a different example.
If the car breaks, it's the problem of production. And here, the problem of manufacturing. But in this case, the problem, I think, like the general problem with insurance company is this business. It has the conflict in its essence, because basically their strategy is not to give you money. Your strategy as a consumer is to make them pay. So this is the conflict in the very essence of the business. And the fact is that I think 6 out of 10 insured adults in America, they experience problems when they use their insurance in general. That was like the survey published, we'll show it here, by one of the non-profit organization. But yeah, I think like if in general 6 out of 10 adults have problems to get the money from the insurance, it means that, okay, insurance policy works well for the business.
Because they don't pay it out.
Yeah, they don't pay it out. But again, it creates it naturally creates the discontent in the society. So I think I agree. I don't see this as a major sign that the society in America is like against the insurance companies, like, okay, let's make them all bankrupt and change the system. I don't see this. But I might think that we might see, if the trend continues, if they continue to have this high refusal rate, if we see maybe even, I don't know, maybe if we see even more like, public discontent with healthcare, I think we might see like not the wave of crimes, but might see more crimes like that against the healthcare executives, insurance executives, something like this.
So I disagree. I really disagree. I just don't see it. I don't think people are necessarily blaming the companies themselves. I think they're blaming the system more than anything. Again, I didn't find any data that made it clear to me that this is a top priority for Americans. Obviously, it's a huge cost that people have. Again, businesses and individuals, which is the healthcare premiums. The deductibles in many cases are very high, which means you can't even access your insurance until you pay out of pocket up to a certain amount, which is what a deductible is. But I don't think that this is necessarily a huge societal issue. So I'm not worried about this type of like lawlessness or this type of like mass crime outbreak against insurance companies. But what I do think, and again, I mentioned this on the politics episode. So when we were talking about the takeaways for the Democrats moving forward politically, I think healthcare remains a Republican weakness. This is something where the Democrats had won a lot of elections under Obama and subsequently talking about the healthcare issue. This still hasn't been solved, which is why are Americans paying so much more for healthcare? Why is the American economy burdened by massive healthcare spending, whereas a lot of other countries don't necessarily have that problem? So from a political perspective, I think there's a solution in here somewhere, which the one of these parties is going to sort of build into its platform. My guess is the Democrats, because this has traditionally been a Democrat platform. I could also see the Republicans doing it in this sort of MAGA concept of, we want to make America great again. We want to make our health care great again. We want to make it, cheaper, more accessible, whatever the case is. But it to your point, it remains a problem. It still is an issue. I don't think this is, again, going to lead to some sort of societal outbreak of violence. I don't think this is a trend necessarily at all. I think this guy is just is a psychopath. But I do think there's a political remedy that probably can and should take place, because it is still difficult for many Americans. So somewhere, again, not to societal chaos, but needing a political solution.
Okay.
But you think this is going to be Mad Max type of
no, I don't think
chaos and
Mad Max of people fighting for insurance.
Yeah,
no,
maybe.
I don't think so either. I don't think so either. But I can imagine the situation where we will hear more about crimes like this if we continue with the same 6 out of 10 getting problems with getting their claims paid.
They better pay healthcare CEOs a lot more money then if that's going to be the case. Yeah, I don't see it, but yeah, time will tell. Time will tell.
Yeah. Now let's talk about another social, socially loud topic. Let's talk about layoffs.
Yep. Go for it. Go for it. What do you got?
Okay. I think everybody heard about it, but let's discuss it in details. Last week, an Indian, not a major Indian, small Indian beauty company conducted a stress survey among their employees. So basically, they launched a survey, internal survey, where they asked their employees, basically, guys, how stressed are you? And what can we do to help you with the stress? There was like a survey. There are some screenshots all over the internet. And employees who admitted that they're stressed and who scored high in this survey, they received the email from the company saying that, you know what, we care about you. That's why you're being laid off, in order to de-stress. Of course, the whole survey, emails, everything went viral. I think this company called Yes Madam. Next day, of course, they published that no, nothing happened. We didn't lay off anyone. Like, that was the miscommunication, misinterpretation, and all misses. But this is not the first time with ugly layoffs or layoffs but non-layoffs and so on. My question is, seems like we have many layoffs over the recent 5 years, basically since 2020, since the COVID. And they are all quite weird. They're massive, weird, ugly, many of them. Is it our new reality now? Are we going to live in this world of weird layoffs?
Well, give me some other examples.
Okay, let's go. So, January 2023, Alphabet, Google, they announced the layoff of approximately 12,000 employees, which is 6% of their global workforce. Before 2023, for the recent for the 3 years, they've been hiring massively. One day they announced 12,000, and they do it just like with massive emails. Another one, Tesla, 2024, they announced of, I think it was just, I'm checking, like, yeah, it was 2% of their workforce. The next day, after they announced this layoff, they opened 800 of new vacancies, of new vacant positions. Then another one, okay, Volkswagen. I think we talked about this in the previous episode when we were talking about the Germany. They announced the plan to cut 15,000 jobs, 10% salary cut, and freeze a couple of plants. Again, ugly, and it's very, very strong sign of the Germany industry. These are just the random numbers. I have more. Actually, there is a whole website called layoffs.fyi where you can see in the real time how many positions and how many people were laid off, primarily in tech companies, but you can see this.
Yep. So the question again. Yeah.
Let me repeat the question. My question is like this. We have many layoffs. Many of them are ugly in the way they are handled or presented, or at least, if not ugly, but weird. And my question is it our new reality? Is it our new reality with these layoffs happening in the corporate world?
100%. So I firmly believe that these layoff issues are going to continue and persist. It actually goes back to a few episodes that we've done. One was on the global economy where, again, as you remember, I was very pessimistic about the outlook for the global economy. A lot of it has to do with geopolitics and politics. So if you look at Europe, for example, I really want to hone in on the Volkswagen issue. Before I get to that, though, I'll talk about a little bit around Alphabet, around Meta. I know who fired a bunch of people, a lot of these U.S. tech companies. So when we think about what happened in U.S. tech post-COVID, there was a huge explosion in tech usage, tech demand. We all started working from home, so we all needed new tech products, tech services, everything around that. They dropped interest rates to zero. They pumped money full of the economy. So who did the best in that period of time? It was tech companies. So again, whether it was the stock market, whether it was company performance, these companies were doing phenomenal. So now that we've entered into this new era, this higher inflation era, this geopolitically sensitive era, this higher interest rates and everything else, those tech companies, those massive hiring binges that they did, we're now seeing a lot of that obviously was done in excess. And once the cycle corrected, which was higher interest rates, more expensive to borrow money, more expensive to hire more people, naturally there was going to be some sort of reversal to the mean. So I think because tech companies saw that biggest artificial boom well, it was a real boom. It wasn't artificial, but that massive boom during COVID. Then you had interest rates drop to zero. These tech companies were flush with cash. They brought on way too many people. And again, CEOs, I think like Mark Zuckerberg and others have said, we overdid it during the pandemic, and now we obviously are needing to tamp it down. So these big tech companies, I think absolutely these layoffs are going to continue. Again, companies like Tesla, I would imagine, whatever, these large corporate companies looking to cut costs, higher interest rates, a more complicated economic time, naturally we're going to see this. Then you've got some layoffs that are a bigger story than just the Teslas or just the Alphabets. So that's an economic question. That's like a cycle question. What you have with Volkswagen, which is more concerning, is a greater German issue. And this has to do with the dynamics in Germany itself, which I don't think are going anywhere, and I think are going to get worse. So what we saw is that Volkswagen, I think, had its biggest layoffs in 87 years, if I read that correctly.
In 87 years.
87 years.
87 years.
That's before World War II.
Exactly.
That's before, German reunification. So think about what Germany's been through in the last 87 years. And the biggest layoffs in its history are happening now. The reasons for that, I think, are not going to change. So what you're seeing here is slowing sales, greater Chinese competition from the electric car market. So that's obviously going to undercut from a price perspective. Volkswagen is selling 500,000 fewer cars in Europe just versus 2019. So that's obviously a very troubling sign. Plant costs for the physical plant are 50% higher than what Volkswagen was expecting, and twice as expensive as the competition. Biggest reasons for that: the labor costs in Germany, highly unionized labor force, demanding high wages, high benefits, and energy costs. Energy costs have skyrocketed since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So if you look at German households, for example, they are still paying today 75% more when it comes to energy prices than 2021, late 2021. So again, kind of post-pandemic, but pre-Russian invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, factories are impacted by that too. This dynamic isn't going to change. So if you look at, you've got one issue, the business cycle, higher inflation, higher interest rates naturally is going to negatively impact hiring and growth and all these other things. But then you have these geopolitical dynamics. That's not going anywhere. I don't think Germany's going to suddenly start re-importing Russian gas tomorrow, even if there's a peace deal. So I think these problems are systemic, not going anywhere, and likely to get worse. So I think the layoffs, to answer your question, yes, they're going to continue. Hopefully they're not as weird as some of these examples like the one in India and whatnot, but I think we should brace ourselves for that. We should expect it. And in some of these geopolitically sensitive areas, I think it's going to be exponentially worse. But that's my take. What's your view?
I partly agree. In a way that I partly agree in the way that yes, they will continue. But I disagree with my own question in the way that there is nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. The mass layoffs, it's not a new it's not a new thing. It's not a new event. We have always seen it. Every time in the times of economic decline, or in the signs of economic decline, or in the particular cases with some particular companies, we could see the mass layoffs, because anyway the people costs are always one of the largest costs.
It is the biggest. Yeah.
One of the depends on the structure of the business. But what I wanted to say also is why we see these layoffs as like so weird and ugly, because there is no more such thing as an internal communication. Everything that happens in the company goes public immediately. Everything gets viral. So every time I think 10 years ago, if something like that could happen, nobody would have heard about it, because it would stay internally in the company. Even though the same weird things might have happened, like okay, let's do the stress test and then fire you. But now it gets viral, and it can, especially with the remote work, where suddenly the layoffs became, they started to make them on the video calls, on the Zoom calls, and it's very easy to record. The moment you are laid off, you recorded this, you publish this. Okay, here you go. We have the viral video. Everybody knows that, Elon Musk say okay, I don't like how you look today, so you're fired, and so on and so on. So there's no such thing as an internal communication anymore. That's why we hear about these layoffs, and it's both. It's a good thing and a bad thing, because it's a bad thing in a way that it creates more stress, and people get more stressed. Okay, everybody's experiencing layoffs, so probably my company's next, even though there are no signs for that. But it's a good thing again because the employees have, more ways to protect themselves. Like, don't do it ugly. Don't do it ugly. That's the message to the managers. I would say, don't do it ugly. Do it gracefully. Even though layoff is like one of the hardest management decisions that one can take. Then, regarding your point on the geopolitical topics, yeah, of course, the economic tense driven by the geopolitical issues. Again, it's nothing new and it's not going anywhere. With that, I totally agree with you. And I also think that in particular in the Volkswagen case, there is even more, because I think like 5 years ago, they also paid a huge fine for the environmental fraud. Huge fine. I think we will need to check this and we will show it over here. But I think it was in billions of euros. So that was a huge fine. And then again, automotive industry, I think in 2008 and in 2020, these two industries, they suffered the most because during pandemic, Volkswagen plants, they were they were stopped. Nothing was produced, and there was a huge break. It was a huge break in supply chain and everything. So they suffered even more, not only in the geopolitical issues, but in, I don't know, what can we say? Pandemic, is it a geopolitical issue or is it a social issue?
Yeah, social. I would
So
say.
whatever,
Yeah.
all these outside issues. So in Volkswagen case, like all the stars, they like connected in the same very unlucky point for the company, and I really hope that they will survive.
But nothing was worse in 87 years.
Nothing was
So
worse.
that's-
Nothing was worse. Yeah. This is like unprecedented thing. Yeah.
I think it's a sign of wider European and German decline on account of geopolitics and demographics, and this is a much maybe wider conversation.
So
to
you
have.
think also this is also one of the puzzle pieces to our European integration?
It can be, of course, and then you have
discussion.
Chinese competition and all these other things, new entries into the markets. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's again, you got the economic problem, which is natural, and you're going to see that. But I think some instances like Volkswagen and what's happening in Germany can be worse. So let's see. Let's hope for the best and hope it's not a major trend. But yeah, I think that pretty much covers it.
All right, let's wrap it up.
Excellent. All right, well, everybody, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Culture Clash podcast. We got Vlad back now, so I think that's great.
Woo-hoo.
And if you like our content, you like our stuff, give us a like, subscribe to our content, follow us on Instagram, and we'll see you next week.